Buddhism for Today, The Essential Wisdom of the Threefold Lotus Sutra by Nikkyo Niwano. Part 2, The Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma. Chapter 18, The Merits of Rejoicing. This chapter further emphasizes the merits of first rejoicing in the Lotus Sutra by explaining the merits in greater detail. Why does the Buddha reiterate rejoicing in this fashion? It is because, to respond to the teaching with joy, to feel profound gratitude for the teaching from the bottom of our hearts, is an indispensable primary element of faith. No matter how many sutras we have read, and even if we have memorized every Buddhist doctrine, so long as it does not induce within us a profound gratitude for the teaching, we are only knowledgeable about Buddhism. Our knowledge does not indicate we have faith in the Buddha. It is our feeling of joy that speaks to our faith. Hence, in this chapter, the Buddha repeatedly explains the merits of rejoicing in particular. Faith is often said to be like multiplication. The overall magnitude of our faith is the product of the excellence of the object of our faith, multiplied by the intensity of our belief in it. Even if the object of our faith is the most perfect in the world, if our attitude is incorrect, or the intensity of our faith is weak, we cannot expect to see the results of this faith reflected in our lives. Allow me to use a mathematical metaphor to illustrate this. Suppose that the figure of 100 represents the Buddha's teachings. If the intensity of a person's joy in the teaching is 0, that is, minimal at best, then 100 multiplied by 0 equals 0. At the same time, however strong a person's religious faith might be, the result will be of no value if the object in which they are placing their faith is ineffectual, because 0 multiplied by 100 also equals 0. No matter how earnestly we believe in something of little value, the result will be 0. Moreover, if someone has faith in a misguided teaching, we should not be surprised if the result is unhappiness. Assuming that the misguided teaching has a negative effect on people, which in terms of our mathematical metaphor could mean the equivalent of -1, and supposing that the intensity of their faith is 100, the end result is the extremely negative outcome of -100. While admittedly a simplification, this mathematical metaphor allows us to easily imagine what terrible consequences faith in misguided religious teachings can have. The teaching of the Lotus Sutra is like an infinite positive number, but for argument's sake, let us represent it with the figure 100. If we experience confidence in the teachings deep within our hearts, feeling a sincere appreciation for the Lotus Sutra for even as little as a moment, and even if we assume this brief response is the equivalent of only a figure of 1, just as multiplying these two numbers produces 100, the results of first rejoicing are highly positive. If our first rejoicing in the teaching is so important, how much greater will our merits be as the intensity of our faith increases, becoming a figure of 2, 5, or even 100. Of course, our merits would be beyond limit or measure. This chapter opens with Maitreya Bodhisattva asking Shakyamuni Buddha, World-Honored One, if there are men and women who, hearing this teaching of the infinite lifespan of the Buddha, rejoice in it by experiencing feelings of profound gratitude, how great will be their merits? To be sure, Maitreya understands perfectly well the extent of the merits of rejoicing, but as we might expect of the Bodhisattva, who exemplifies the compassion of the Buddha, he asks this question with the intention of encouraging all living beings to strengthen their faith even more, and thus requests that the Buddha explain the merits of rejoicing at length for those who are at a basic level of understanding. The Buddha answers Maitreya, clarifying the merits of rejoicing by explaining them in the following ways. Ajita, after the Tathagata passes away, suppose there are monks, nuns, male and female lay practitioners, or even everyday people of average intelligence who are not even followers of the Buddha. Whether old or young, it doesn't matter. In any case, assume that whatever sorts of people who hear this teaching rejoice with feelings of profound gratitude, and then leave the place where they heard the teachings and go somewhere else, to a monastery, a quiet place apart from the affairs of the world, a bustling street in a big city, a country village, even a hamlet out in the middle of the rice paddies, whatever place. They impart what they have heard, as they have heard it, to their parents, relatives, friends, and acquaintances, according to their abilities, to the extent that they have the ability and opportunity to do so. And now imagine that all these people who hear the teaching also rejoice in it with feelings of profound gratitude, and they, too, set off to share the teaching with others. On hearing the teaching, all of these other people rejoice in it, and like those who have heard it before, these people also proceed to pass the teachings on to others. In this way, The teaching continues to spread in turn from one person to the next. Now suppose that this cycle continues as many as 50 times. Ajita, the merits of the 50th person who hears this teaching and is moved to profound gratitude are truly immense. I will now explain it to you, so listen carefully. At this point in the chapter, Shakyamuni Buddha begins to spell out 3 important points that we should not carelessly overlook. What they have heard, transmitting the Dharma as one has heard it. The first important point is the phrase, what they have heard. This expression means to transmit the Dharma to others as the Buddha taught it, in the way that one has received the teachings. For people who are new to Buddhism, it is important that they share the teachings with others just as they have learned them. If they do not, there is a possibility that they will impart the most important points of the teaching wrongly. Transmitting the teachings to others as one has learned them would seem a simple thing to do, but it is more difficult than you might think, as shown by the following well-known social psychology experiment. In this famous experiment, researchers have a number of university students stand in a line. The person at one end of the line whispers a very short story in the ear of the next person, and in this way, the story is quietly transmitted from person to person until it reaches the final person in line. The story is extremely short, something like the following. Mary happened to pass just when John and Jim were arguing with each other. Because Jim's face flushed bright red in anger, Mary assumed that Jim had lost the argument. Even such a brief story changes significantly when it passes through as few as 10 people in this fashion. Changes in the exact wording do not make much difference, but in many cases, the entire gist of the story changes, with Jim defeating John in the argument, or John's face becoming infused with anger instead of Jim's. Why does even such a simple story change when orally transmitted by word of mouth among a group as small as this? One person might mishear the story, whereas another remembers it incorrectly and mistakenly relates its main points when they retell it. And still others may interject their own interpretations, confusing the story entirely. Subjective bias is often the culprit that causes mishearing and slips of memory. For example, if we harbor a preconception that the person who gets argued down should have a ghost-white face because they are intimidated and fearful, we are likely to hear that it was John's face that was flushed red with anger, and remember the story incorrectly. It would be a catastrophe if the teachings of the Buddha were mistakenly transmitted in this fashion. Therefore, the Buddha cautions practitioners to transmit the teachings as they have heard them. A person who has grasped the very heart of the teaching may make flexible use of skillful means to share it with others. In fact, changing the way one teaches in accord with the listener's needs is a given. But one who is new to the Buddhist teachings should not forget the Buddha's words of caution. The Buddha's disciples paid meticulous attention to the issue of faithfully transmitting the Buddha's teachings. 4 months after the Buddha's passing, 500 of his leading disciples gathered at Rajagriha. First, they validated the teachings that each of them had heard from the Buddha, and after ascertaining the correct words of Shakyamuni, they took great pains to memorize them perfectly. Such a council for compiling the Buddhist sutras was called a Samgita in Sanskrit, literally a gathering for joint recitation, in effect, an assembly for confirming the teachings. According to tradition, the council followed these procedures. Ananda, who, as the Buddha's personal attendant, was the disciple who had heard the Buddha's expositions most often, was chosen to recite the teachings, and Mahakashyapa, who presided over the council, asked one question after another about the teachings. When, where, to whom, and in what circumstances the Buddha had expounded them, and what their contents were. Ananda would answer every single one of these questions. The remaining 498 disciples listened closely to their exchanges, and if Ananda's answers coincided with their own memories of a particular teaching, they would all agree that their memory was correct. If even a single one of them raised an objection about a teaching, it was not cleared. Majority vote and other such methods are preferable options when ordinary people want to bring discussions to a conclusion. But because the Buddha's disciples were keenly aware that they were engaged in the sacred task of compiling a definitive version of the Buddha's teachings and methods to be left for posterity, they approved a teaching only on reaching unanimous agreement. Once the entire council agreed that a teaching was indeed exactly as they had heard it from the Buddha, they would recite it together and commit it firmly to memory. This is why nearly all sutras begin with the words, "Thus I have heard." The earliest of the Buddhist sutras to begin circulating, such as the Agamas of the Chinese canon, roughly corresponding to Nikayas of the Pali canon, frequently repeat the same or very similar phrases because at the Buddhist councils, the Buddha's disciples had to preserve the teachings by perfectly memorizing the kinds of question and answer dialogues that Mahakashyapa and Ananda engaged in at the first council, and this was greatly helped by reiteration. Repetition has been edited to a great extent in Mahayana texts, including the Lotus Sutra, but a great deal of repetition is still used in portions where its use was deemed necessary to leave a deeper impression on readers. I have strayed somewhat from my main point in order to leave readers with a lasting impression of just how important it is to transmit the teachings of the Buddha as one has heard them, according to their abilities. The second important point in this passage above is the phrase, according to their abilities. The meaning of this phrase is twofold. First, it tells us that we should explain the Lotus Sutra to others in a way that is suited to our ability to do so. Second, it tells us that we should nonetheless exhaustively devote all those abilities we do possess to sharing the teaching of the Lotus Sutra with others. It is hardly possible for a person who has just heard the Lotus Sutra for the first time to expound it to others as effectively as an extremely learned or eminent monk. So it is not a problem if a beginner stumbles their way through, and there is no requirement that one be an eloquent speaker to share the teachings with others. People who have a flair for the pen can even share their teachings with others through writing. In any event, people should impart the teachings of the Lotus Sutra in ways suitable to their talents and experience. This is the first meaning of the phrase, according to their abilities. No matter how poor someone is at speaking in front of others, if they strive wholeheartedly to share the teachings to the very best of their ability, their enthusiasm will not fail to make an impression on people. In short, it's an issue of sincerity. This is the second meaning of the words, according to their abilities. The 50th person who hears in turn. The third issue we must consider is the reason the sutra makes particular reference to the merits of the 50th person, who in their turn hears the teaching and responds with joy. The purpose of this section of the chapter can only be to powerfully express the magnificence of the teachings of the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra's profound impact on all who hear it. We can understand how the passage accomplishes the same by considering the following. In the usual case of a religious message or teaching, the first person who attends a talk at a church, temple, or other house of worship hears a sermon directly from a minister or other leader who has mastered the teaching and is quite convincing, and for this reason they are deeply moved by what they hear. All the following people who share the teaching in turn, from one person to the next, however, have just heard it for the first time. They do not have a broad knowledge of it, nor do they have deep faith in the teaching, or extensive experience practicing it with others. Even if they are able to pass on the message of the teaching exactly as they have heard it, the impression the receiver of the message feels, their joy in the teaching, gradually weakens in direct proportion to the distance from the original speaker. By the time it reaches the 50th person, most religious teachings will no longer leave a deep impression on those who hear them, and at most, those who happen to hear the teaching will shrug it off with a remark such as, "Oh, is that so?" But the Lotus Sutra differs from other teachings in this regard. As long as the message of the sutra is correctly transmitted, even the 50th person is certain to be deeply moved by the teaching and receive it with joy because the message of the Lotus Sutra is so magnificent. Obviously, the joy that 50th person feels will inevitably be weaker than that experienced by the first person. But even this degree of joy brings with it great merit, as the Buddha explains next. It is easy to pass over this section and overlook its significance, but we should recognize the profound meaning of the words, the 50th person in turn. The merits of the 50th person. Next, the Buddha describes the merits of the 50th person who responds to the teaching with joy. We should be careful to note that the Buddha depicts these merits in highly symbolic ways, using vivid similes in order to express abstract concepts in concrete terms. We must not take these passages literally, but grasp their underlying meaning. Otherwise, we run the risk of falling into an absurd misunderstanding of the Buddha's teaching. The same can be said for all of the following chapters of the sutra. Suppose someone wanted to make all living beings in the universe happy, and give to each and every one of them whatever they need to live lives of pleasure. Living beings obviously indicates the people within the realm of human beings, but also includes the living beings in the realms of hells, hungry spirits, beasts, asuras, and heavens. The category of living beings encompasses things born from both eggs and wombs, such as birds and beasts, and also minute creatures born in moisture or by spontaneous generation. This donor gives all of these living beings a whole world's worth of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, pearls, agates, coral, amber, and all manner of wonderful jewels. And along with these treasures, this person also bestows on them elephants, horses, carriages, and palaces and pavilions made of the precious 7 substances. In short, the donor gives them all the goods they could ever want. Suppose this wealthy benefactor continues such charity for as long as 80 years, and eventually has the following thought: I have given all living beings what they desired so they can enjoy life, but these living beings are getting old, since 80 years have already passed. Their hair is gray and their faces are wrinkled, and their deaths are fast approaching. I must guide them by teaching the Buddha Dharma to all of them. He then gathers all living beings together, and by explaining the Buddha Dharma to them, teaches them to transform themselves, showing them the truth and teaching it to them, thereby benefiting and delighting them. All living beings are overjoyed to learn the Dharma, and are motivated to put it into practice, so in a single moment they all attain the enlightened states of stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arhat, and free themselves of all defilement. Having attained immovable states of consciousness through deep meditation, their minds remain free and unencumbered, undisturbed no matter the circumstances. They also attain the 8 emancipations, states of meditative concentration that free one from any attachment to external phenomena. There are several difficult terms and expressions in this passage that require clarification. The 6 realms of existence was introduced previously. See pages 44 through 46. The words, some are born from eggs, some from wombs, some from moisture, and some through spontaneous generation, are a reference to the notion in Buddhism that living beings come into existence through the 4 types of birth. Perhaps the only one that requires further explanation is birth by spontaneous generation. This type applies to certain beings such as hungry spirits and those in the hells and heavenly realms, who instead of being born in the first 3 ways, come into existence according to their karma by simply materializing out of thin air. Since the category 4 types of births includes all the ways in which living beings come into existence, it is an expression that can be used to mean all kinds of living beings. Let's consider the following 4 phrases in the text of the sutra. Some are with thought, some are without thought, some are not with thought, and some are not without thought. The first phrase, with thought, refers to beings who, because their minds are turbulent, mistakenly discriminate between things. The second phrase, without thought, means beings who have attained a state of serenity by extinguishing the functioning of thought. The third phrase, not with thought, indicates the state of mind of beings who are free from the coarser defilements that afflict beings of less advanced states of mind. The fourth phrase, not without thought, is an even higher state of consciousness, in which only extremely subtle forms of defilement remain. The third and fourth phrases both indicate the mindset of beings in the heavens of the formless realms. Despite their refined states of consciousness, these beings exist in the heavens within the 6 realms of existence, and they have not yet attained Buddhahood. The words showing, teaching, benefiting, and delighting in the phrase of the sutra, showing and teaching the truth to them, benefiting them, delighting them, were already explained on page 167. The 4 terms beginning with stream enterer and ending with arhat are the 4 stages of awakening that were said to be attained by Shravakas. The first, stream enterer, is a sage that is characterized as joining the company of the Buddha's disciples, so called because one has entered the stream leading to nirvana by freeing oneself from the delusions arising from the mistaken views that living beings experience in the realm of desire. The second, once returner, literally means a person who will be born only once more before becoming an enlightened arhat. At this stage, Shravakas are said to have freed themselves from the first 6 of the 9 types of defilements of cognition that afflict people in the realm of desire, but as some defilements remain, these Shravakas can still potentially experience delusion. The third, non-returner, is one who is in their final lifetime, during which they will attain the awakening of an arhat. These practitioners have already eliminated all the defilements of cognition that people experience in the realm of desire, and they are at the stage of being able to completely eliminate all mental defilements. The 4th and highest attainment of the Shravakas is arhat, a person who has already wholly freed themselves from all delusions and attained a completely pure and perfectly tranquil mind. The normative path of practice was for Shravakas to progress step by step through these 4 stages, but in this passage of chapter 18, Shakyamuni Buddha explains that the living beings that the benefactor teaches traverse all of these stages at once. Finally, the term 8 emancipations refers to 8 types of meditation for freeing oneself from deluded attachments to things. The world-honored one then asks Maitreya Bodhisattva, "What do you think? Are the merits this benefactor obtains many or only a few?" Maitreya immediately answers the Buddha, "This benefactor's merits are extremely abundant, truly immeasurable and boundless. Even if this benefactor had given living beings only material things, his merits would still have been beyond limit or measure. How much greater they must be, since he also enabled those living beings to become arhats and free themselves from their delusions." The Buddha then spoke to Maitreya, placing greater stress on his words. "Now I will state it for you clearly. The merits of this benefactor, who not only gives all manner of material goods to all living beings throughout the universe, but also enables them to free themselves from their delusions, do not even come close to the merits of the 50th person in turn, who feels joy on hearing even a single verse of this sutra. The benefactor's merits do not equal even 100th, 1,000th, or even 1,000,000,000th of that 50th person's. In fact, it is not even possible to compare their merits using calculations such as these. Donating the Dharma is superior to donating material things. There are 2 reasons that it is impossible to compare the merits of such a benefactor with those of the 50th person who hears this teaching. The first is that material donation and donations of the Dharma are categorically different. Donating material things is certainly a good deed, but the merits of such actions are finite and relative. Take the example of giving money to a destitute person. Receiving the donation of a relatively small amount of money might become the first step toward one person getting back on their feet again. For another person, however, it might lead to a more comfortable life for as long as it lasts, but after they have spent it all, they may end up no better off than before, or worse yet, that sum of money might have the unintended result of encouraging a person to become lazy or develop a taste for luxury. Thus, while material donation is in principle a good thing, in the end it is a finite and relative good. Incidentally, when we donate money or material goods, we can also teach people how to restart their lives by using these donations in the most effective ways. The benefit of such generosity can persist for a long time. This kind of useful advice can be one way of donating the Dharma. So if the Dharma is donated along with material goods, the material donation will become far more effective. It would be ideal if social welfare and other related programs were also undertaken in this fashion. But even in that case, such donations would still be finite and relative, because the merits they afford people come to an end at the conclusion of their lives. The donation that is truly valuable, and whose effect continues infinitely, is the donation of the Dharma, giving the Buddha's teachings to others. The influence of this kind of generosity does not last only for one lifetime, but extends to posterity. There is nothing that equals the merits afforded by donating the Dharma. The great vehicle's infinite potential to expand. As the Buddha explains to Maitreya, in addition to making all manner of material donations to all living beings in the universe, the benefactor also gives them the donation of the Dharma by expounding the Buddha's teachings, enabling them to become arhats. Even so, the Buddha explains that the merits obtained by this person cannot compare to those obtained by the 50th person in turn, who when hearing even a single verse of the Lotus Sutra, rejoices in it. This may sound surprising, but the reasons are as follows. Attaining the level of an arhat, the stage of having freed oneself from all delusions, is the pinnacle of the non-Mahayana Buddhist teachings. But if such an enlightened person ends up isolating themselves in the mountains and practicing alone, the influence of that person's merit stops there. The teachings of the Buddha are extraordinarily precious, but their value cannot be actualized unless Buddhists share them with others, elevating listeners and giving them strength and courage, and in turn uplifting the entire world. So long as Buddhists confine themselves to their temples in pursuit of their own awakening, or devote themselves mostly to carrying out funerals and memorial services, they are not manifesting the true heart and mind of the Buddha. The Lotus Sutra teaches that it is not enough to attain liberation only for oneself. Its main point is that we pursue bodhisattva practice to help others attain liberation from suffering. For this reason, When a person hears even a single verse of the Lotus Sutra and is overcome with gratitude for the teaching, that feeling is sure to aid the liberation of other people and develop into the power to help the entire world. To conceptualize this multiplier effect, suppose that an Arhat's awakening is equivalent to a perfect score of 100 points. Compared with this number, the experience of hearing even a single verse of the Lotus Sutra and rejoicing in it for the first time may be worth only 1 point. Even so, there is a huge difference between the value of 100 points attained by means of a lesser vehicle and a single point obtained through the great vehicle teaching. This is because the single point of the great vehicle teaching continues to expand infinitely and has the potential to eventually reach 1,000 or 10,000 points. Think of a single person's awakening as comparable to 500 bushels of rice set aside in storage. This is the amount of rice necessary to support a single person for an entire lifetime. Once it is all gone, however, that is the end of it, and even while there is rice remaining, some of it may be eaten by bugs, pilfered by rats, or simply rot without anyone's realizing it. On the other hand, the joy one experiences for the first time after truly hearing even a single verse of the Lotus Sutra is like a couple liters, approximately 3 pounds, of unhulled rice for sowing in a seed bed. Because these seeds are alive, they retain the potential to grow and increase, multiplying their yield by 100 or even 1,000. Herein lies the reason that the merits of experiencing joy when truly hearing even a single verse of the Lotus Sutra are far greater than those gained when one person performs both the extremely noble act of making the greatest possible material donation and giving the gift of the Dharma that enables people to attain arhatship. So far, we have been discussing the merits of the 50th person in turn who rejoices when hearing the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. But what about the very first person who hears the teaching? The Buddha now explains the merits of such a person to Maitreya. Ajita, if the merits of the 50th person in turn who hears the teaching of the Dharma Flower Sutra and rejoices are this great, the merits of the very first person who experiences joy when hearing the teaching at the Dharma assembly are truly immeasurable and boundless, beyond any comparison. As explained before, because of the magnificence of the teaching itself, the person who hears it still experiences joy, despite the fact that it has been transmitted to that person through 50 other people in turn, who were themselves all newly acquainted with the teaching. The Lotus Sutra makes an even greater impression on a person who has heard its teachings directly from someone who has attained a deep insight into its truths. The profound impact the sutra has on people becomes the great turning point in their lives, and we can hardly imagine the extent of the wider influence it can have on society as a whole. The importance of helping others connect with the teachings. Until this point, we have been discussing the merits of people who respond to the teaching of the Lotus Sutra with gratitude. Next, we will consider those who are not at such an advanced level, people who are not deeply moved by simply encountering the teaching, but will nevertheless obtain great merits. The fact that these people obtain such merits teaches us just how important it is to have contact with the Dharma. While we all certainly have Buddha nature, we cannot attain liberation unless we awaken to our Buddha nature through such an opportunity. First and foremost, coming in contact with the teaching is the precondition for liberation, and the opportunity to encounter it is truly precious. Consequently, giving another person an opportunity to encounter the Dharma is an extremely noble act. Shakyamuni Buddha next explains the merits of a person who hears the teachings of the Lotus Sutra for even an instant and encourages others, inviting them to hear the teachings. In addition, Ajita, if anyone goes to a place of practice because they want to hear the teachings of the Dharma Flower Sutra, and if they listen while sitting or standing to someone explaining the sutra for even as short a time as an instant, because of this merit, they will be reborn in an extremely wonderful place, where they will ride on magnificent mounts and in splendid carts, and in these carts they will be able to ascend all the way up to the palaces of the heavens. Again, if any person sitting at a teaching of the Dharma sees others who have entered after the exposition has begun, and encourages them to sit down and listen, or scoots over to share that person's seat with others, because of this merit, such people can be reborn in the abodes of benevolent deities, such as chakras or great Brahma heavenly kings, or, if they are reborn in the Saha world, They will sit alongside a wheel-rolling sage king. Ajita, if anyone says to another person, "There is someone who teaches a sutra called the Dharma Flower. Let's go together and listen to what they have to say," and if that person they invite follows their suggestion and goes to hear the teaching for even a little while, the merits of that act will allow those who have invited them to be reborn where there are bodhisattvas who have the power of Dharanis. Chakras and the great Brahma heavenly kings are the most supreme of the benevolent deities who protect Buddhism. A wheel-rolling sage king is a universal monarch who rules the world peacefully in accord with the Buddha's teachings. Bodhisattvas who have the power of Dharanis are those who teach people by convincing them to impede everything that is evil and persuading them to advance everything that is good. What this passage tells us is that those who provide others a chance to encounter the Dharma Flower Sutra are as noble and exalted as those benevolent deities, sage kings, and great bodhisattvas. To be reborn in the worlds of those great beings is a way of saying that because of rebirth, their spiritual transformation, the lives of those who give others the opportunity to encounter the Dharma will be completely transformed. This chapter tells us that such people will not only be spiritually transformed, but will also be reborn in bodies with various exquisite physical features. It is not necessary to examine every single one of these characteristics. It is enough that we understand that a spiritual transformation also manifests itself in someone's physical features, and that one's mind can transform one's physical body. This kind of change appears very slowly, however, and one's facial features will not change significantly during their current life. Moreover, the physical changes described here do not refer to physical beauty as opposed to ugliness, but to a sublime radiance that issues forth from the depths of one's spirit. The more we undertake spiritual discipline, the more brilliantly we can all shine. When we see portraits and images of venerable or renowned monks, or of saints and sages, we find very few who are beautiful or handsome in the usual sense of the word. Even when we look at the depictions of the 10 great disciples of Shakyamuni Buddha, there are none, with the exception of Ananda and Rahula, whom anyone would even venture to call handsome. And in Japan, this has led to the tactful idiom, "a person with a face like an arhat." Nonetheless, each of them is depicted either with a compassionate and ineffably serene face, or with noble features that reveal the depth of their wisdom. As people such as the Buddha's great disciples gradually accumulate bodhisattva practices over the course of successive lives, this spiritual refinement increasingly transforms their facial expressions. Eventually, their bodies take on the 32 marks and the 80 kinds of beautiful features possessed by Buddhas, including Shakyamuni. We, too, can develop the noble features of a Buddha. The impact of our spiritual transformation is not limited to our minds. Its influence is also certain to manifest physically in our bodies. The latter change occurs only very slowly, but it does occur without fail. This is how we can interpret these highly symbolic passages of the Lotus Sutra.